do it. Okay, and we are live with Miss Carlee Hayes from Nutrisense. Welcome to the show, Carlee.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, so I'm honored to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. And can you tell us your title and what your job is like?
Definitely. So, as you had mentioned, I work at Nutrasense
Mhm.
and I am the lead dietitian nutritionist. So, day in and day out, I am working with users to help optimize their glucose, reach their health goals. And I love it. I love it so much. I'm also involved in some of the social media, the marketing, do a little bit of it all because that's what you do in a small company. So, very blessed to have that role. My career started in not this role at all. I was in a very traditional setting. So I was working still with individuals in an outpatient setting, but working in a clinic with individuals with diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, heart disease, all those different things. You name it, I worked with it. And what I found was there was kind of this disconnect between getting people the help that they needed early on, right? A lot of times these people were being sent to me after just getting that diagnosis. So they'd come and they'd feel pretty discouraged, they'd feel frustrated, they didn't know where to start. And I started to think there's got to be a better way, right? We've got to address this stuff early on so that we can prevent it in the first place. And I know just from listening to your podcast, you kind of feel some of the struggles that I do as well, is that you kind of feel alone in that. There's not a lot of focus on prevention and optimizing health. We're concerned with what's normal, but not what's optimal. So that's what drove me to be where I'm at right now. And I feel very blessed to have this ability to help users in this way.
Yeah, that is so awesome. That's such a great story that I find that so many people are, catching their issues when they do get that diagnosis. And I heard from uh glucose goddess. I'm not sure if you follow her on Instagram. I'm sure you do. Uses CGMs and she posts her data all the time. I had her on the show and she said something on the show that just really struck me and stood with me. And she said that prevention is not sexy. And she's right. Like people in general as humans we're like, oh yeah, but that's not going to happen to me, that doesn't matter. And a lot of people who have dysregulated blood sugar, they catch it when they're full blown diabetic. And we know, both of us especially working in the fields that we work in, that blood sugar dysregulation is a spectrum and it can start becoming dysregulated and you might not see any symptoms. You might not know what those symptoms feel like. And there's years and years and years and decades that go by until you finally get this diagnosis of potentially like type 2 diabetes, or in my case, it was PCOS. But I didn't know I had issues with my blood sugar. And there were so many signs. And so I love that Nutrisense, if you don't know, Nutrisense is a company that that has continuous glucose monitors. I don't want to say makes. I'll let you kind of talk about them in a second, but they have continuous glucose monitors, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And this is such a wonderful tool to help you kind of tap into what your body is doing and to kind of, there's this whole like unfelt system that is going on and all these things going on in your body that you don't feel and that you don't know. You can't always feel when your blood sugar goes up a little bit or down a little bit. And you can tend to feel that when they're at those extremes, but that's already after there's this dysfunction. So I love this idea of bringing these continuous glucose monitors to the masses so that we can all biohack a little bit and realize, like, oh my goodness, this food or in general, my blood sugar is just out of control. And it's so great to be able to rein that in before you get that diagnosis. So I thought you were going to say something, but if you want to tell us a little bit more about Nutrisense and continuous blood glucose monitors, that would be great.
Definitely. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. It can be really frustrating when you start to see these issues and it feels like no one's paying attention. But really, what we found is that the CGM, that continuous glucose monitor, can point out those little yellow flags, those little warning signs
Mhm.
early on. So instead of waiting for that diagnosis and crossing your fingers that it doesn't affect you, you're able to address those issues early on and be proactive with your health, not reactive. And so when we think about continuous glucose monitors, they're a sensor, right? You've worn one. I know a lot of your followers probably know what those are, but in case you don't, right, it's this little sensor that sticks to your skin, kind of like a Band-Aid. And what happens when you apply it is you're inserting a small microfilament into your interstitial fluid, and that's going to measure glucose continuously 24/7. So instead of a traditional finger prick device, which a lot of people have probably used and have found the pitfalls of that, right? They're not convenient. They show you one point in time, like a snapshot. So it's not indicative of your overall metabolic health. That CGM gives you 14 days of continuous data. And with that data, you're able to see any abnormalities in glucose metabolism. And that can help point your diet, your lifestyle, whatever we're working on, in the right way to address those based on your own biology. So when we think about, all these different things, type 1 diabetes, would not be included in this because that's not necessarily that chronic preventable condition, but type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, right? It's not just diabetes. All of these abnormalities, all these chronic conditions have that core of glucose metabolism. So when we're monitoring that, we can really make changes early on. And so when I think about a CGM and kind of why it's helpful, there are three main benefits that I'm looking at. And the first one, we've already talked about it, right? That early identification of issues. So it's estimated that approximately 80% of those chronic conditions can be prevented or at least delayed with early lifestyle intervention. So looking at your diet, looking at your lifestyle, addressing stress, sleep, all those other factors, doing that early on can prevent 80% of those. And if that doesn't empower people, I don't know what will, right?
Yeah, that's
Like,
amazing. That's so amazing.
the power is in your hands. We just have to know how to harness it, right? And I think the CGM does that really well. We probably all heard the statistic that approximately 88% of Americans are not metabolically healthy. So 12% of us are optimal metabolic health. That's can be really discouraging. But what we can do with the CGM is we can identify, this is benefit number 2, identify those behaviors, those foods that are working well for your body. So I think, working as a dietitian, and I think why a lot of dietitians have a bad rep is that a lot of times people are prescribing a one size fits all diet. You do this one thing and you're going to be healthy. And when it is that simple, it's obviously wrong, right? It's never that simple. It's always more complex, and our bodies are no different. So there are so many different, microbiome differences, genetic differences, lifestyle preference differences that really shape how we eat and how we're supposed to eat. So when we have that CGM on our arm, we can see in real time how our body's responding to our diet. And I know you have mentioned there's some foods that don't work well for you. A really good example of this, I can eat an entire can of beans and my glucose barely moves, right? That's a very high amount of carbohydrates. But in a lot of the people that I work with, and in some of the dietitians that are on my team, maybe even a small amount of that food will cause their glucose to spike into a range we don't want to see. And really, like you had mentioned, if we're not monitoring it, we would never know that. We think of beans, fruit, sweet potatoes, all these different things as generally healthy foods. And while they can be, for some people, they're going to cause some responses that we don't want to see. So we can see which foods work well for us and kind of fine tune our diet based on our own biology, which is really empowering.
Yeah.
So have there been any foods that you've seen that spike you a little bit more and keep other people within the right range?
Yeah, so I love what you're saying all about this whole bio individuality because that is really what I stress on this show. And I talk about self experimentation all the time because we can give general guidelines about what might spike your blood sugar or not. And I find that actually putting it into practice and seeing how it is on my own body is really eye-opening. So a lot of times the quantity of what I was eating really affected my blood sugar response. And so one of the things that spiked my blood sugar like crazy, like the biggest spike that I had seen was a really big acai bowl. And I used to eat those all the time. So this is, if you don't know what an acai bowl is, it's like essentially a smoothie bowl. So they blend acai, which is a fruit, which is actually has like no carbs in it. I think it has like 2 carbs or something, no sugar. So it's a very unsweetened berry, but they blend it with bananas and strawberries and blueberries, and they put honey on the top, and there's granola. And I got a bigger bowl, and I ate it at night. And so we can talk about timing, but my blood sugar was elevated for over 8 hours. It didn't come back down to baseline. It was like something, it was over the night. I mean, it was like a mountain range on there. So it's supposed to be like a little tiny, foothill, right? That little
Right,
spike.
right.
Yeah, that spike in blood glucose. I swear it was like the Andes Mountains. It was so crazy. So,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting that you say that because before I first wore my CGM about 1 year ago. That's when I started monitoring.
Mhm.
And right before, I remember going to Hawaii and they have acai bowls. That's huge there, right? So I remember my husband and I got an acai bowl, and I won't say where it was from because I still love that place so much. But I remember feeling like I could not keep my eyes open, right? After I ate it, I was just exhausted. I felt terrible. I had to go back to the hotel and take a nap. And then it wasn't until after I started monitoring with a CGM and seeing how those high glucose values from acai bowls can cause those high values and how that's linked to my energy levels, that I started to realize, wow, I wonder what my glucose was when I ate that acai bowl. That was huge. So
Yeah.
you're right. Those are huge.
Yeah,
So
definitely. And, certain other things would spike my blood sugar, like white rice, of course. And other things would be much less. And it also depended on what time of day it was and what I was having with the meal. So maybe we can talk. Well, I wanted to talk before we go into those hacks. I really just want people to know, why is it important that we have this glycemic control, and why is it important that we don't have these high peaks and valleys in our blood sugar? So what does that look like?
that's an excellent question. And what I would say, probably to start off with first, is to answer the question, what is glucose? And really, that's our body's primary metabolite, right? It's our other vital sign. I like to think of it as a window into our metabolism. So when we monitor glucose, and I do think that everyone should monitor glucose at least once in their life, what we can do is find out how our metabolism is working and how it's responding to our diet. And then, like I mentioned, those little abnormalities can give us some insight into maybe some things that we need to be proactive with and make changes on early on. So, with glucose, when we think about that, our body likes to keep glucose within this tightly controlled range. So, usually that's around 70 to 120, 70 to 140. There is a little bit of debate about the optimal range, but really what we're seeing is that our body likes to keep glucose between that tightly controlled range, and that's going to help our body stay in homeostasis. And so when we are pushing glucose outside of that range, usually a little too high, right? Based on some of the foods that we're eating or other factors that can push it outside that range, our body and our insulin is having to work really hard to pull glucose back into that range. So when we think of our body as maybe like a car, that would be like pushing the gas pedal all the way down to the floor and keeping it there over and over. And what that is our bodies, or the car's gonna have to work really hard to overcompensate for that. And the same is true for our body. Our body's gonna have to work really hard to keep glucose in that range. And really, I'm not concerned with the occasional spike. I think a lot of times people are nervous to wear a glucose monitor because they're scared of that one spike, but that's not what we're concerned with. We're concerned with that repetition and that frequency of those glucose excursions above that healthy range. And so what's happening is when our body has that high glucose value, short term, what we're going to probably feel is some big changes in energy, mood. We're going to have poorly regulated hunger cues. We're going to feel hunger all the time, right? Because we're on that blood sugar roller coaster where our body's working really hard to get it down, to push it back up, and that can throw those things off. So when we start to monitor it, we can start to notice, okay, when my glucose goes above this level, I start to feel kind of sleepy. And then about 2 hours later, I'm hungry again, even though I just ate. So short term, we're going to see those small little changes. And I think that's one cool thing about wearing a CGM too, is that you can start to build that better mind body connection and start to understand your health in terms of how it makes you feel. And then when we're talking about repeated exposure to those higher glucose values, those big peaks, like you mentioned, over time, if we're pushing our glucose outside that homeostatic range over and over again, we're going to start to see oxidative damage, maybe some microvascular damage. We can see more inflammation, ultimately insulin resistance, and then other metabolic abnormalities and disease states. So those abnormalities take years and decades to develop, but starting to see which foods and lifestyle behaviors take you outside that range can really help you hone in that glucose and keep it in a good range.
Love that. That was really well explained. And so, going back to the ranges that you said, well, first off, when I got a Freestyle Libre, so this is the one, if it's it's different from the one that Nutrisense uses. They use another version of the Freestyle Libre. Is that accurate?
So we use the Freestyle Libre or the Freestyle Libre Pro. We just have different software, different app software.
Okay, yeah, it was the Pro that I had when I had my Nutrisense sensor, and it was a different app on the phone, and I felt like it was a little bit more helpful and accurate in seeing the peaks and valleys and just truly understanding what the number meant. When I used the Freestyle Libre, and this is if you have a prescription, I happen to know someone who could write me a prescription for Freestyle Libre, so that's how I got mine. And when I originally applied it, you have an app that is associated with it. And the program itself had the range that they wanted the glucose to be in from 100 to 150. And this it bothered me so much because I can't believe that that is what the mainstream health, first of all, they don't make it accessible to the public. And secondly, they have the ranges in there that are just way too high. And personally, for my blood sugar, if my spikes went up to 120 or 140 on the daily, that would be really, really bad for me personally. And that's where I think that we can't say with 100% certainty for every single person the range needs to be from 70 to whatever. We can't say that top number because I think it is very individual as to what is going to happen afterwards, right? Like, we're just looking, blood glucose, blood sugar is just one measure. So we don't exactly know what our insulin is doing when this happens. We might be hyper responders and it's just not showing, right? So we're not seeing insulin. So we just have to kind of infer what's happening with insulin based on what the blood sugar is doing. And just as a little refresher, if if you're new to the podcast, insulin is what helps to take blood sugar out of the blood and put it into the cells of the body so it can be used. So it will put it into the muscles, it will put it into the liver for storage, it will store it as fat if there's excess. So that's insulin's job, is to lower the blood sugar by taking the blood sugar out of the blood and storing it in the body or for energy or for storage for use later. So anyway, those ranges are very problematic to me because we want to be in that lower range. So in mainstream medicine, this is just important to know because a lot of people only have access to going to their doctor. They go to their family doctor, and I just want to arm you with the tools to be ready when you get your fasting blood sugar taken and it says 99, and the doctor is going to be like, "Great, perfect." Well,
No.
according to us and what we see in our practice, that's not perfect. It's not horrible, right? It's not in the diabetic range, but it's still not optimal. So we are going back to that optimal health. And so we really want to see those fasting blood sugar ranges from 70, I would say a little bit above 70. I don't know, 70 could be fine for some people, but for me, that in the past, that would have been feeling a little hypoglycemic. So again, we're, 70 plus or minus, whatever that is for you, to approximately like 80, high 80s. That is, I feel, a comfortable range for a lot of people for optimal health. Of course, like we were talking about, it could be plus or minus a little bit depending on just your body. So not getting hung up on that one number, right? Like you said earlier, that fasting blood sugar, if we take the one finger prick, that's one mark of our blood sugar. That's just one one little data point of information. So with these CGMs, we can see all these data points. So you mentioned, let's go into those hacks again. So we were talking about what we could do to prevent the blood sugar from going up too much and other things that kind of affect how much your blood sugar is going to rise when you're eating. So do you want to talk a little bit about, maybe what's typical with we see with time of day when you're eating and other factors that can kind of influence the spike of the blood sugar?
Definitely. You bring up so many good points. I feel like you're speaking my language. I want to go back to the Freestyle Libre app because you are definitely right. It is programmed a little bit differently than ours. But when you think about that, I do think the Freestyle Libre app is great, but it's really geared towards management of a disease condition.
Mm,
So that's a different population, right? I think a lot of times in
yes.
research, we take diabetes research and we apply it to normal, non-diabetic individuals, and those are completely different systems and they work a lot differently. So we can't expect the same range to be in those different populations. So for people that do have type 2 diabetes, perhaps staying between 100 and 150 is a great goal. But for someone who's seeking optimal values, which hopefully, the average person that's just trying to make that proactive change in their life is looking for those, right? So we're not settling for normal, we're looking for optimization. And that's really what we focus on. We do have a lot of users that have type 2 diabetes. And of course, our goals are going to be a little bit differently. With diabetes, we're trying to usually keep those spikes below 160 versus a normal, healthy, non diabetic individual, we're trying to keep it below 140. So the goals and kind of the range is going to depend on your disease state and your metabolic health when you're coming into the program. But the cool thing about our app is that we can adjust those um, thresholds to what works for you. So,
Yeah.
like you had mentioned, if you feel better below 120, we can change that upper threshold to where you feel your best. When we're looking at research, right, 140 above 160 is where we start to see a lot of metabolic damage. But
Mm.
my biggest thing is, how do you feel? There's a lot of different recommendations, but if you're not feeling great where you're at, then we need to make some different changes. And I see this a lot, right? A lot of times we'll have a spike to maybe 120, but it started a lot lower. So your swing was a little bit bigger. And that
Mm.
makes you feel really sleepy, or you don't feel great, or you feel low energy. And that's when we can address that and kind of fine tune it to what you're experiencing and optimize that to make you feel your best throughout the day. So just wanted to touch on that really briefly.
No,
And
I
then,
love that. That was great information. Yeah.
yeah. And like you had mentioned, if you're spiking to 120, 140 and you're not feeling great, then we need to look at your postprandial metrics. So there are three big trends that we're looking for. We talked about fasting glucose, right? That's the one that you would get from your doctor's office. And you're right, we do want to see that between usually about 70 to 90. There's some research that's coming out saying that 82 to 88 is kind of the sweet spot. But I know you had mentioned you feel good in the mid 70s, and that's where you feel kind of stable in the morning when you're fasting. That's completely fine. We do have a lot of other users that maybe they dip just below 70 and they feel completely great. A lot of times that's keto, low carb users, right? But if you feel good and you feel stable without any signs of hypoglycemia, then that's probably what's normal for you. So, listening to your own body and finding what feels good for you is super, super important. And then when we come to those postprandial metrics, we're really trying to look at two big factors, right? So we want that spike in glucose. And it's important to note here that glucose does not have to be a straight line. I think a lot of times we think that any fluctuation is not great, but really those fluctuations are normal. And our glucose responds and our insulin responds to all the meals that we eat. So we want to see, like you had mentioned, those rolling hills in glucose, not those jagged peaks. So that's kind of our goal. And optimally, we're going to see a smaller peak, right? So ideally less than 140. And then we want it to return back to pre-meal values within about 2 to 3 hours. So what's cool is that in your CGM, you can see that whole entire response. If you are using a fasting meter, a glucose meter, you're going to have to prick yourself a ton, right? Like 30 minutes after the meal, 1 hour after, 2 hours after, to see kind of a depiction of what your response is like to that meal. But on your CGM, you're going to see that continuously. So again, less than 140 peak, and then we want a quick return to baseline because that's going to tell us that our insulin is working appropriately. So when we're talking about that, sometimes we will see a spike that's higher than that 140 range. And there's a lot of different reasons that that could happen. You had mentioned that, different foods kind of spike you up a little bit higher. Of course, that's the first thing that we always think of, right? So looking at the type of carbohydrate that we eat and the amount. So sometimes just changing up those two little small factors can make a huge difference in what your glucose response is to a meal. So for instance, say you spiked from a whole apple, but you do well from a half apple, that's kind of your threshold, right? Other things that we can do are to add a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat, and then consume that portion first. And that is enough to kind of blunt that glucose response. So, food is probably one of our bigger influencers of glucose metabolism, but it's not the only one. But
Yeah.
when we're looking at that, yeah, there's a lot of different things we can do within food. And I know you had mentioned timing. I would say that is probably the most shocking and most common trend that we see, is that the timing of your meals matters just as much as what you eat. So our insulin sensitivity is very, very closely aligned to our circadian rhythm. And so we're going to have better insulin sensitivity in the earlier part of the day versus later in the evening. So it's highest middle day, right? And then it's lowest in the middle of the night. So when we time our eating window for eating with daytime hours, eating during those earlier daytime hours, we can really drastically improve our glucose responses. We could see someone have a great response to a meal for lunch and then have that exact same meal for dinner time, and they're going to spike outside of range. Or like you had mentioned with the SCE bowl, they stay elevated for longer, right? So that's because
Yeah.
our insulin sensitivity is so much lower at that time. So adjusting your eating window can make a huge difference in how your body responds to.
Oh, that's so awesome. That's such great information. So, to sum up what you said, we want to be eating during those waking hours, and our insulin sensitivity is much better during those morning afternoon hours than they are at night. And so a lot of people, especially in the keto community, they skip breakfast, they eat a late lunch, and then they eat dinner. And for some people, for social reasons, they eat dinner with their family and all that. That's sometimes why people choose that. But if you have the ability to switch up when you're eating, if you're doing an intermittent fasting practice somewhat regularly, it would be a really great idea to shift your eating window to the morning and daylight hours, because your insulin sensitivity is so much better. And especially if you're coming to a fasting and keto lifestyle because you want to improve your blood sugar responses and you want to reverse your insulin sensitivity, you get, like, it's a win-win if you make your eating window in the morning, because you'll have that better insulin sensitivity. And then you'll know that if you wanted to potentially have something that's higher carb, if you're doing a carb up, if you are someone who's not doing keto and you know that you just like to generally do lower carb and you want to include them, now, and we've talked about these hacks before, that eating protein and fat before you eat your carbohydrates can do wonders in just slowing, kind of blunting that glucose response, like you said. So it's not this huge spike. I mean, that's essentially why we have dessert at the end of the meal, so we don't start with dessert, right? Don't start with dessert. My wife was famous for this, and she's like, oh, let me just have this first. I'm like, no, it's going to mess up your blood glucose. Just wait till the end. So she would wait. She now waits till after the meal. But that's
I love
something.
it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's huge. And I have all my friends thinking of that too. So I'm with you. I'm talking about this all the time. That's such a simple solution that can make a huge difference. And another
Totally.
thing too, and I thought this was from that same study that kind of showed that eating protein first could really blunt that glucose response. Same thing with eating your vegetables first. And I think this is so interesting. We go out to eat, we usually start the meal with a salad. There's a definite reason behind this. Both the non-starchy vegetables, so low carbohydrate vegetables, and protein can help blunt that glucose response,
Love that.
especially if you're eating them, 5-10 minutes before that meal starts. And we've seen this so often in our users, and it's such a quick, easy hack that can make such a huge difference. And when we're talking about a salad, we can throw some apple cider vinegar on top of that, and that can even improve our response a little bit more. So these are small little things that you can test with your CGM and see those big changes in real time, which is really, really motivating.
I love that. I love the idea of potentially having, because on this podcast before, we talked about the apple cider vinegar hack where you drink a little bit before your meal, and people wonder like how long before your meal. Ideally you do it, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes before a meal, but I just do it right. I take a shot from the bottle. It's pretty intense. It feels like, a shot of vodka. Some people, you can mix it with like half water. You just do a small amount. If you add some cinnamon into it, it doesn't do anything for the glucose response, but it makes it smell like apple pie. So it makes it much more palatable. So for people who don't like to do the apple cider vinegar, I made this mix and I kept it in a jar in my fridge, and it was 50% apple cider vinegar, 50% water, and a few sprinkles of cinnamon. And I would just take, 2 swigs out of that before I would eat, because it's right there in the fridge and I would remember it. And then I'd eat my meal. I didn't wait or anything. And it has that double benefit of increasing your stomach acid to help you digest and to blunt that glucose response as well. And so I like the idea of, instead of drinking it, having a small salad to start your meal, having that as the vinegar on, in the dressing. You have the healthy fats that you're going to put on there too. It's a perfect idea to have that as at the beginning of the meal. Then you have the rest of your meal, and then if you're doing any carbohydrates, save those for last. And that's such a great hack. Love it.
100%. I think one thing that we monitor in our app, which is really helpful, is your delta value. And that is the total amount of change in your glucose from the start of the meal to 2 hours after. So what we can see is, okay, maybe I kept within my glucose range, but I had this bigger swing. And that led to me feeling just kind of low energy or unstable mood, whatever it was. We can monitor that. And when we're trying different things like the apple cider vinegar or having protein first, we can monitor that metric and look for those actionable, very specific changes in that number to show that we're on the right track and that what we're doing is actually making a difference, which definitely really empowering.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to, I know you had mentioned, protein and fat beforehand. One thing I always want to mention is that the combination of starch and fat can be really tricky sometimes. So when we are combining higher portions of both carbohydrates and fats, and a lot of times this is in a restaurant meal, right? We see this a lot because they're adding things that we don't even know that they're in there. Look at curry, for example. There's a lot of added sugars, a lot of added fats in a very low carb meal, right? So when we are seeing both of these foods kind of in the same meal, what can happen is that we see multiple spikes in glucose. So we had talked previously about how we want that glucose to return to that pre-meal value within 3 hours after eating. And a small amount of fats with your meal, a little bit of avocado, some olives, some olive oil, whatever you're doing, can really help bring glucose down quickly. But too much of either fat or starch, or even worse, when they're both combined together, can cause what we call multiple spikes. So instead of this one response to the meal, we're going to see multiple spikes in glucose. And
that happened with that acai bowl.
Yes. What did they put nuts in it or anything? Or
yeah, there were
yogurt?
probably, there was some coconut milk and I think there were some nuts and things like that, and like chia seeds. So yeah, the combination was deadly.
Yes. And a lot of times we see this with, like I mentioned, restaurant foods, but very common foods that we eat late at night, like
ice cream,
pizza, fried foods. Ice cream is a great one. And what we'll see is we have this like maybe moderate spike, but it continues to spike or stay elevated all night long, right? And that's because fat is our slowest digesting macronutrient. So I like to think of carbohydrates as our kindling on a fire. If you've ever made a bonfire and you throw just a little bit of kindling on top of it, it's gone before you even know it, and you have to add more and more and more. And that's exactly what carbohydrates are in our body. They're digested really quickly. Their digestion starts in the mouth. So by the time they get down to our stomach, they're digested really quickly. They're metabolized very quickly, and our glucose can shoot up very quickly. Fat, on the other hand, digests a lot further down in the digestive system. So when we combine those, we can have a slower response, and we have glucose being released in bouts after the meal. And that can cause a lot more what we call area under the glucose curve. So a lot more under here, right? Glucose is not returning back to baseline, even if we're staying within limits. So that's an
So
interesting trend.
yeah, and I think you actually just articulated why it is that I was eating a paleo diet, and that is when I was seeing the worst outcomes in my glucose. And I developed PCOS and insulin resistance from, even though I was eating healthy carbohydrates, they were whole food carbohydrates, things like sweet potatoes and fruit and smoothies and things like that. But I think because I was doing paleo and had meat and fat and protein and fat as well, it was just high in all the macronutrients. And so having the higher fat with the carbohydrates was setting me up to have a lot of issues. So, yeah. And I wanted to
Exactly.
ask, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one quick thing is that, yeah,
Mhm.
we see that with, someone puts some good quality grass-fed butter on a sweet potato, you would think that would be an optimal response, but we can see that same, multiple spikes from that just because of the composition of the meal. So sometimes assessing that composition, changing up either the starch content or the fat content, boosting the protein, adding the apple cider vinegar, those small little hacks can make that long response go to an optimal response very quickly. So that's really
Yeah.
cool to see.
Yeah, that's really great information because if I am having carb up sometimes, I always feel that I do much better with fruit as opposed to a starch. And I wonder if that's because, first of all, the starch is harder to digest for me personally, but the starch I would tend to do, let's say, like white rice with ghee or a sweet potato with grass-fed butter. And so again, there's that fat component in there that's probably causing this issue. So, my question that I have written down is it better to have a sharp spike that comes down quickly or glucose that stays elevated a little bit longer but doesn't go as high? So, sometimes we see this if we're, like I'm just not sure, it's inconclusive in research that I've looked at. So, what's your take on that?
I think it is really tricky. One thing, like I mentioned, we want to monitor that area under the glucose curve because really, when we're having these longer spikes and when we're having these bigger spikes, our area under the glucose curve can be exactly the same. And
Mhm.
what that means is our insulin is having to work for longer periods of time and it's having to work extra hard. So I think both of them are suboptimal responses. And I'm not sure if one is worse than the other. I'm
Okay.
always going to say that having your glucose higher, above that healthy range is going to increase your risk for that oxidative damage, all those other things. But the same is to be said when we're stimulating that insulin response over and over and over again by having a long drawn out spike.
Right.
So I don't think there's an easy answer. I think both of those are things that we want to address and that I'm talking to people about all the time. Because sometimes, if your glucose is staying within the green, above or below 140 all the time, you're doing great. It's a little bit harder to catch those longer, more drawn out responses, right? And
Yeah.
so that's where looking at, your area under the curve and looking at how quickly you return to baseline, that can tell you a lot more about how your insulin is responding to the meals that you're eating, even when you're staying within that good range. I do see a lot of keto people that sometimes we can kind of address that and they see huge changes. So both of them equally important. Big purpose is to keep our insulin working as it should. And we see this a lot with grazing patterns of eating as well. If you're eating
Mhm.
all the time, every hour and a half, you're eating a little bit of something, or every 2 hours, you're snacking, you're stimulating your insulin response over and over and over again. And so, even though you're having maybe small little spikes, you're still causing that to work over time. So, there are populations that do need to follow that plan. If you have gastroparesis or if you've had bariatric surgery, you do need to eat more regularly. But for the general population, adequate time in between your meals can really help reduce that as well.
Absolutely, totally. And that's a really great point. I'm very anti snacking for the most part, just because we don't even realize how many times a day just the average person is just putting something in their mouth. It's like you walk by the fridge, oh, a couple grapes. Like you walk, you just grab a handful of this, or there's a chocolate sitting in a jar, or you take a few bites of something, and then you have your meals, and then you have your snacks between your meals. It's every 5 seconds, we're just constantly putting something in our mouths. And just when you take a hard look at that, it's like so many people, if they just stopped snacking and just had like 3 meals and maybe even thing of dessert, literally. Even if you just ate 4 times a day, that's a huge, huge improvement from the 16, 20 times a day that the average person is probably putting something in their mouth. So that's a really great point. And some people who have reactive hypoglycemia, maybe you need to eat a little bit more often at the beginning, so I'm not saying never snack ever, don't ever do it. Like, there's always, some leeway, but for the most part, I'm pretty anti snacking because it's just a great way to help not only your blood sugar kind of and your insulin levels come back to baseline and normalize, but you're also giving your body a break from having to digest constantly. If we're always digesting, we're not doing the other processes that we need to do. The intestines aren't cleaning out. We're not detoxifying as we should be, and a lot of people at night, we're supposed to be detoxifying at night. We're not supposed to be digesting. And so it just goes to show you, of course, our insulin sensitivity is not good at night because we're not supposed to be eating at night, right? It doesn't make sense biologically with our body. And so, of course, everything is slowed down. Everything is ready to, just clean house and relax and whatever. And that's something I see. I have my Aura ring, which tracks my sleep. And that is something that gets so affected. If I eat late at night, my ring gets so angry. And sometimes it will be snarky at me and be like, "Did you eat too close to bed?" I'm like, "How do you know?" Like it's so accurate sometimes. I'm like, "How did you know that I ate something?" I'm like, "I did. You caught me." And the ring doesn't lie. Yeah. So,
Right. Yeah. And that's the same with glucose. We always call it our truth meter because it's going to tell you, it's that immediate feedback of your decisions. So I think a lot of times when we're trying to make big changes, there's a disconnect between that acute decision, that choice that we're going to make, like, should I limit sugar today or whatever it might be, and that long term consequence, right? Optimal metabolic health or whatever we're seeking. So I think seeing that data, whether it's in your Aura ring, your CGM, whatever you can use, is going to provide that feedback to help you guide those decisions and stay on track. And yeah, with
yeah.
fasting or with fasting in between your meals, right? Adequate time in between your meals. We see this sometimes where glucose will slowly start to rise throughout the day and it never fully comes back down to baseline. And so that's kind of that warning sign for me is, okay, are we allowing our body time to return back to baseline, to rest and digest and reset our insulin before we have that next meal? And if we're not, are we truly listening to our hunger cues, or are we eating out of emotion based boredom, right? We're all working from home right now. So it's easily accessible. Is it just a convenience item? What are the things that are driving us to make those food decisions? And when we see that data, we can kind of dig a little deeper into the motivations behind that.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that immediate feedback. And, sometimes people can't see all the work they're putting in and they don't necessarily feel different or they don't see any difference on their body. But to have that feedback of the continuous glucose monitor showing you, like, "Oh, wow, that meal didn't spike my blood sugar." At least you have that little win. So it can be really, really helpful for people who are having a hard time staying consistent. And it just gives you another kind of external what's that word I'm looking for, reinforcement or just validation that what you're doing, you're on the right track. So you
100%.
started talking a little bit about this earlier, and I really wanted to talk about some non-food factors that we see spiking blood sugar because, to be honest, those were my highest spikes, were when I exercised and when I was out in the heat in the Orlando sunshine. I was setting up my kayak and I could feel my heart pounding. Sometimes when you're in the sun and your heart is pounding because it's so hot out, I don't know, that happens to me sometimes. That was when my blood sugar spiked so much and when I took showers. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some of these non-food factors that might spike your blood sugar.
100%. And yeah, we saw that a lot this summer with all the heats, everyone out in the sun. Glucose is very, very responsive to heat. And while there are a couple different theories behind that, the big thing, especially with CGMs, is that The interstitial fluid, what the CGM is measuring, is very, very responsive and sensitive to changes in fluid, hydration, and just kind of that sort of thing, which are all very influenced by heat, temperature, and we see the opposite with cold temperatures. So when it comes to, like, we see this in the sauna as well, we're going to see this drastic rise in glucose. And a lot of times that is because the fluid shift in the body is going from the interstitial fluid. And so the concentration of glucose can be a lot higher. So sometimes it's not an accurate spike, right? Sometimes it's just because that concentration of glucose is a little bit higher. The other thing to think about is that hydration. Even small changes in hydration can really affect your glucose for that same reason. So a lot of times when people are out at the beach or they're running in the heat, they can be mildly dehydrated, and that's going to reflect in your CGM and your glucose response. Gotcha. The other thing to think about is it could be causing a cortisol response, right? That higher intensity exercise, heat, all of those can cause very, very small hormetic stressors on the body, and that can result in a little spike. So we can dive into that a little bit more, but we do see that a lot. The only other thing I always like to point out is that the temperature kind of range for the CGMs is a little bit lower. So if you're outside of that temperature range, you can have what we call a false spike. And that's just because the temperature is so high, the CGM is not measuring accurately. So a couple things to keep in mind, but it definitely can be a true spike. We have seen people really improve these spikes by focusing on their hydration and then also electrolytes. In that summer heat, especially if you're lower carb, if you're keto, having a low vitamin C, no sugar electrolyte replacement can do wonders for your glucose values. We've had a lot of people that work in like a hot factory or they're doing outside work, and we've been able to mitigate some of those spikes just by addressing their hydration and their electrolyte balance, which is really cool to see, you know, just making that small change and seeing such a big response.
Yeah,
So,
that's really awesome. And those are minerals and hydration, along with blood sugar, digestion, fatty acids, and eating a nutrient-dense whole foods diet. Where I went to school at the Nutritional Therapy Association, those are our foundations of health. And so it's not surprising to me that, you know, some of the foundations are affecting the other ones, and they're all important. And that's why we see blood sugar as being so important for not only diabetes, but also literally every other chronic disease. Blood sugar has a hand in creating or leading the way for potentially having negative outcomes with every area of health. And that's why sometimes it's so hard to pin down what the symptom is that it's coming from blood sugar, because it's showing up as migraines, or it's showing up as joint pain, or it's showing up as hormone dysregulation. And it's like, really, my blood sugar? It's just, it feels elusive. So again, this is great to kind of point out like how it can be so, I don't know, impactful.
right?
Yeah.
We always like to think of glucose as being influenced by four main pillars. And that, of course, the first one is food. We all know that one. That's probably the most obvious one. But of course, it's not just what you're eating, it's the timing, it's the portion size, it's the macronutrient composition, it's the quality, the processing. All those different factors play a role.
Yes.
But the other three factors, the other three influencers, those pillars are just as important as food. So you had mentioned exercise or movement. This is a huge one, right? The other two factors are going to be stress and sleep. Yes.
I knew it.
And I like to think of those as all, like, think of your health on a pedestal. And those are the four pillars holding it up. If one of those is off, the whole thing can crumble down. So a lot of times we're hyper focused on food, but really it's our stress that's not managed, or we're not sleeping well, or we're not moving our body in a way that works for us. So addressing that whole body, like you mentioned, like in your schooling, that functional approach, you're looking at the whole body because all of those pieces matter. And nutrition is a huge piece of the puzzle, but it's only one piece.
I
So,
love that.
when
Yeah.
we're talking about,
Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. There's a little delay on Zoom. And so like I keep interrupting you. I'm sorry. Continue.
You're totally fine. And when we go into those other pillars, I think we all think of exercise, right? We know that that's great for our health. We know that it's wonderful, but it can really do wonders for our glucose metabolism too. And it doesn't have to be like we're just running or we're doing a CrossFit workout. Consistent movement throughout your day is just as effective. And so one thing that we see a lot is that when we're sedentary, which a lot of us are working sedentary jobs, right? That our glucose isn't being utilized as much. And so we're not burning through our glycogen stores, our stored glucose. And so what happens when we eat foods that are converted into glucose, that glucose has nowhere to go. So it's staying in the blood for longer. It's keeping our glucose a little bit more elevated. So walks throughout your day, consistent movement, little EMOM workouts just to break up your day can help utilize that stored glucose and make room for glucose coming in. The other thing I always like to kind of recommend is strength training. So
Yes.
strength training specifically is so important for building more glucose storage space.
Yes.
So it can increase the amount of storage that we have in our muscle, which is so exciting to see. And that can really improve our responses to our meals, our postprandial responses. So getting in strength training, resistance, whatever that looks like for you, but also staying consistent with your movements, especially with postprandial walks. This is probably one of the biggest things that I see is that if you can walk during that peak value of your meal, so like maybe 20 minutes to an hour after your meal, then you're going to see a very big difference in how your glucose responds and how quickly you come down. So walks are huge. Can't stress that enough.
I love that. That is everything you're saying. I'm just like, yes, yes, yes. And so I'll start with go back to what you said about exercise. I love the idea of thinking that when we're going to the gym, we're not going there to burn calories. We're going there to build muscle. Muscle, like you said, is extra storage space for blood sugar to go. So you actually, by building muscle, you become more insulin sensitive. And when you talked about being sedentary, our muscles are some of the first tissues that become insulin resistant. And there is based from the book, Why We Get Sick by Ben Bickman. I'm sure you are familiar with that wonderful book, that the muscles that you're not using as much, there's like a direct correlation between those muscles that you're not working, that are inactive, and their level of insulin resistance. So that means that if I go to the gym and I never work out my legs and I'm hardly walking, and I'm working out my upper body only, which would be weird, that you're going to see a lot of insulin resistance in my lower body, but you wouldn't see it as much in the upper body. And that's why they say that working out your legs and your lower body can help insulin resistance even like at greater proportions, I guess you would say, just because they're bigger muscles. So again, if you're building these bigger muscles, like, yeah, it's great to build biceps, but my bicep is still relatively small compared to my entire body. And so thinking about strength training in those bigger muscles, really, really important. So that's great. And then one of those other hacks for lowering glucose, like we said, are those post-meal walks. That's what postprandial means, if you didn't know. And then, yeah, going for walks, amazing. And so these are things that I talk about all the time. And I actually have a program, a membership site that is coming out either later this year or early next year. And it's called Beyond the Macros. And it's going to be a lifestyle program focused on helping people to build these healthy lifestyles. It's going to focus on those other pillars. It's going to focus on nutrition as well. But these other pillars are going to be really stressed because I find that people are so in tune with the food that they're eating. They're trying so hard to eat everything right and get this perfect diet, yet their stress is unchecked. They're not meditating. They're not walking. They're sitting at a desk all day. And maybe they get to the gym twice a week, but that's not enough. Like you said, we need to be prioritizing sleep. We need to be reducing our stress. We need to be reducing our toxins. High toxins can also cause stress to the body. And when you have stress, you're going to raise up blood sugar. So it's so interconnected. And that is why you can't just talk about one thing in isolation, because everything is affected. And that's why, these doctors that, going to an endocrinologist and then going to the, gastroenterologist and picking apart the body into these pieces, that's not how our body functions. Everything is affecting it. So I love that we are so much on the same page about this the whole body connection and the sleep and all that. So
100%. I see so many people that will go to the gym and they're on the treadmill for maybe an hour, but they're not seeing the results that they want. If you're not working that core, I'm always encouraging deadlifts,
yes.
squats, snatch, whatever you can do to work that core muscle and engage as many muscles as you can, the better your insulin sensitivity is going to be. And now we know that, if you're doing one strength training exercise workout, your insulin sensitivity is going to be higher for 24 to 48 hours after that meal. So just think, looking at that, that's powerful. And a lot of times we will see with exercise like a small spike in glucose, especially if the workout is really intense or it's fasted. And that's just because we don't have enough immediate fuel available to work and kind of use for that workout. So our body is pumping out glucose or making glucose to fuel the movement. And that's not a problem. That's normal. That's our body doing its job to supply fuel when we need it. But when we see it a little bit too high, maybe above 160 to 180, we start to think that maybe that's too much of a stress on the body. So a little bit of a spike, completely normal. If we're doing like a fed workout or maybe a steady state moderate lifting workout, we might even see a decrease in glucose. But really what we're going to see, what the big benefit is improved glucose values for the next day to 2 days afterwards. So seeing that in your data can be that motivation to keep doing those bigger movements and to go to the gym at least every 2 days to keep that insulin sensitivity where it needs to be.
I love that. That is such great information. And the one thing that I wanted to add about working out is that the intensity really matters. And again, back to Ben Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick, he talks about the intensity. So if you are someone who's like, well, I go to the gym, I do some weights, you'll go on some machines, but you're just not familiar and confident. So I went to the gym yesterday and I finally signed up for a gym that has barbells again. I'm like, I missed my barbell and I love lifting. There's just something about it that feels so empowering. I love to feel strong and nothing gets me there like a barbell. I do other things. I do free weights, I do the cables and all that. But there's something about a barbell. And I had some people message me like, oh, I don't feel comfortable with that. And my wife is a personal trainer. So that is why I feel comfortable with it. And because I've had someone help me out and learn how to, manage my way around the gym. And so if you are new to this and really, find yourself stuck, you find yourself at a plateau, you haven't lifted heavy, you don't know, you're afraid of weights. That's okay. Like we all start out that way. It could be really intimidating, all these big buff guys in the gym throwing things around. But I know a lot of my listeners are women. Go to the gym and get yourself a trainer who can help you with familiarizing yourself with this stuff and who can push you, because I used to not be able to push myself on my own. That barbell changes everything because you want to pick that thing up, right? So, but sometimes, you go to the gym and who isn't guilty of like, well, I didn't work out that hard. I work out harder with a trainer. I work out harder if there's someone there, an accountability partner. So the intensity of the exercise really matters. And, just go as intense as you're able to do right now. So don't kill yourself, don't get injured, but really you want to be working your muscles to fatigue. And that's where you see those big changes, because that's how you're building muscle. That's how you're creating that sensitivity. So I wanted to
100%.
talk. What'd you say?
Sorry, I was just agreeing with what you're saying 100%. I do think that especially women should find someone that guide them in those heavier weight situations, because it is scary and we don't want to cause any damage or more harm than good. But if you can find someone that can introduce you to those movements in a safe way, you're going to see more body composition changes than you would with any time on a treadmill, right? So I think I'm glad that your wife helped you into that. I had my brother's friend taught me about weightlifting a couple years ago, and before then I was only like kickboxing. I did just cardio, and I saw major improvements in my metabolic health, but also my body composition. So I think that can be something that can really empower women, but also improve their insulin sensitivity because they're building those bigger sinks for glucose. So highly
Yeah,
agree.
I love that. So there are some things that I wanted to talk about that we haven't gotten to yet. Do you have time? Okay.
Sorry, yes.
So I wanted to talk about sleep a little bit. So we know that sleep is one of those pillars. It is so essential, our circadian rhythm. We already talked about how earlier in the day we have better insulin sensitivity. Later in the day, we shouldn't be eating because we have lower insulin sensitivity. And we talked about how eating late at night can interrupt your sleep, but blood glucose levels and mismanaged blood sugar can really, really affect your sleep. So, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, definitely. Sleep is probably one of the sleep and stress, I would say, are some of the most surprising things that we talk about most often. And
Mm,
I think they're very intertwined. Stress, of course, is going to affect glucose because if your body is perceiving stress, it's going to react as if it's under threat. And that means it's going to release cortisol, it's going to release adrenaline, and all these other things that also shoot up glucose, right? So when that happens, when we're chronically stressed, we have more glucose. But also, what's happening is our body is reducing its insulin sensitivity because it's hoping to keep more fuel available within the body so that we can tap into that if we are truly under stress. If we're being chased and running for our life, we need to tap into that. But right now, in today's modern society, we're not typically being chased. We are just under chronic stress from our job or from bills or from COVID-19 or whatever it is. So we're under that stress and our body's responding the same exact way, but now we don't need that fuel, so it's just keeping our glucose elevated all the time consistently. And poor sleep, whether that is we're not getting enough sleep or we're not getting quality sleep, is perceived as a chronic stressor by the body. So it's going to react that same way. And so it kind of works bidirectionally. If we are having poor sleep, it's going to cause higher glucose values. But then if we have high glucose values, we're going to have poor sleep.
mm,
So it's this vicious cycle that's so hard to get out of. And some things I always like to talk about is that sleep fragmentation, right? If you're not getting into that deep sleep, if you're having interrupted sleep, we can have 25% higher glucose values the next day. So it's going to raise your entire baseline up. And then if we're having not enough sleep, so we need at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep to function properly, to reset, to work our best. Even people that say they need and require less sleep do need that. But what we found is that this can increase your glucose by 20 or 40%. And we can have higher glucose responses and a reduction in insulin sensitivity. So we combine this together, right? We're getting poor sleep, inadequate sleep. We're not prioritizing sleep. We're not keeping that consistent wake and sleep time. We're eating late at night. All these things kind of piled on top of each other can results in that higher glucose values. And then the other thing, right? If we're not getting great sleep, if we're under chronic stress, we're going to have more cravings for foods that cause higher glucose values. And that's our body's natural response, right? If we have a lot of cortisol, if we have a lot of stress in our body is seeking out serotonin to calm that down and to make us feel good. And so it's going to make us crave carbohydrates and sugars and all those other things. And we feel like sometimes we don't have control over that, but it's important to know that this is your body's response to what's going on inside. So those are the biggest things that I work with people all the time about. And sometimes, working on your wind down routine in the evening and prioritizing that good sleep, managing stress, whatever that means for you, can make a huge difference in your glucose. But until we're addressing those, we can be doing all the right things with food and still having suboptimal responses. So, very, very
yeah.
huge and such a big problem with today's society.
Yeah, that is definitely where I see a lot of my clients and a lot of my listeners getting stuck is that, they're eating a super clean diet. Some of them are eating the zero carb diet, yet their blood sugar is high. And so my answer is, well, what are you doing elsewhere in your life? Are you sleeping? What does your stress look like? Are you working out? It's going back to those four layers of, those four pillars are so, so important. So we talked about sleep, and I wanted to ask one more thing about it. Do you most often see people waking up from, if they have reactive hypoglycemia, do you see them most often waking up in the middle of the night because of lows or highs of their blood sugar?
That's a really great question. I would say most often we see them waking up from lows. So I think unless it's very, very high or you're not used to the high feeling, it's not as easy to identify that and it's not
Mhm.
usually going to wake you up. But definitely we do see people waking up in the middle of the night, sometimes feeling panicked when they have that low glucose value. I mean, that's
Right.
important. Our body saying, "Hey, hello, something's going on here," and so we always try to address that early on if we do see that. There's a lot of different factors that can contribute to that nocturnal hypoglycemia. Probably some of the bigger ones that we see, insulin resistance or just more glycemic variability. We do see it a lot in users that have previously had bariatric surgery because their gastric emptying time is a little bit different. So they can have these bigger fluctuations and these lows during the night. We also see it a lot, if you're trying to get better at metabolic flexibility. So you're fasting, you're skipping meals, but you're not able to tap into your fat source as well, and kind of burn that fat efficiently. You're going to have that low because your body's just not as good at it as it needs to be. Menopause, excess caffeine. I would say those are the big ones that we usually see, and we always like to address that. So whenever I see that drop in someone's data, I'm asking, did you wake up? Did you feel this? How are you feeling this morning? And then we can kind of play around with meal timing. Sometimes people do need a snack right before bed. That's very rare, but sometimes some people do. So we
Right.
can kind of play around with that, or just really put all of our focus into improving that metabolic flexibility and the ability to tap into those fat stores as well.
Yeah, I have a client who I started seeing her, and I think this after the second day of seeing me, or maybe it was the first, I told her she needed to increase her fats and lower her carbs. And she's like, I actually didn't wake up in the middle of the night and need to eat something and wake up in a cold sweat and feeling heart palpitations. I mean, some of these things can be immediate changes that you see. So some of the tweaks and that you're making are really going to have a fast impact on how you feel. And the other thing that I see that could potentially do that is alcohol, which is the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about. So tell us a little bit about alcohol and how it relates to our blood glucose.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. That is a huge one that we see over and over and over again. Especially, we see those low values from alcohol that is very low sugar, low carb.
Hmm.
So we can respond to alcohol in a variety of different ways, and that really depends on whether we're fasted or fed, whether or what type of alcohol we are having, and then how frequently we're drinking. So when we're looking at carbohydrate containing beverages, so think daiquiris, pina coladas, margaritas, those
Beer.
those higher beer is a good
Hmm.
one too. Sometimes we see mixed responses to beer,
Hmm.
especially different types of beer. If it's lower in carb, we'll see a little bit different response, but beer can definitely cause a spike as well. But those carbohydrate containing alcohol beverages are going to typically cause a spike. But what can happen, and this can happen with anything that has added sugars or a higher content of carbohydrates that is processed, we can have this spike and then this drop that goes below glucose values that were before the meal, right? So instead of returning to pre-meal values, we're going to see a spike and then a drop below those. And sometimes, if we're having symptoms, that can be indicative of reactive hypoglycemia, just kind of like you're mentioning. So our body is overcompensating by pumping out more insulin than is needed to deal with that glucose load, and that can cause us to return below pre-meal values. So sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't with those types of alcoholic beverages. But when we're having lower carbohydrate alcohol, so maybe wine, liquor, those sorts of things that are very low carb, we usually see no response in glucose. So it's staying stable or it's dipping below. So a lot of times in the middle of the night, if we're drinking later in the evening, we can see this dip below our baseline. And if you're not waking up, sometimes that's not an issue. But if you're waking, that's a sign that your body is not doing well with that drop. And so what's happening here is our body is being impaired by that alcohol. So alcohol can impair the functions of our liver, and that can affect the way that we moderate our glucose levels, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So it kind of alters that balance of insulin and glucagon. And instead of having this normal response, we can kind of have a little bit more fluctuation, but it also can interfere with the liver creating new glucose or breaking glucose down. So the liver can kind of control how much glucose is in the blood by breaking down glucose or creating its own, and alcohol can disrupt that system significantly. And then the other thing that I always like to mention is that when we drink, the liver is going to prioritize breaking down alcohol over breaking down our food, right? So a lot of times we'll see that drastic drop, but then we'll see higher fasting values and baseline values that entire next day. And so that's something a lot of people don't think about, because if you're seeing this drastic drop after drinking, you're kind of inclined to think, well, maybe I should drink with my meals more often. But really, what's happening is you're interfering with your liver, and you're also causing those higher values for a full 24 hours afterwards. So
Wow.
it can be really interesting. And if you are feeling those symptoms, definitely we want to address those and kind of change up how we're drinking.
Wow, that is so interesting. And I I actually had the last time I drank was April 20th of this year. And I was just noticing that I had the worst sleep ever, even if I just had one drink early in the day. I just cannot sleep well. I don't think that my liver can tolerate alcohol. I don't think my body tolerates alcohol. And it would mess up my sleep. And I would feel these drops. And that classic waking up in the middle of the night with your heart palpitating. I mean, that blood sugar drop from all the things that you're saying is it's so obvious that there is that blood sugar drop going on, because when we run out of glycogen, which is stored sugar in our liver, and we don't have enough in our blood, our body senses that our blood sugar is dropping below what it senses as is like a normal level. It needs some amount of sugar in the blood at all times. And it knows that. And so when it starts to go low and now it's running out of its backup source, which is the glycogen in the liver, it has to, in an emergency, raise your blood sugar. And the way it does that is through pumping out those stress hormones, like you talked about before. So, like the epinephrine and cortisol. And so what is epinephrine? It's adrenaline. And so now you woke up and you have an adrenaline rush and you can't fall back to sleep because your heart is pounding. And so that is a huge sign that you have that blood sugar dysregulation going on. And whether it is from reactive hypoglycemia, which we talked about earlier, that's what I had before I went keto. I started my keto with a 3-day fast. Do not recommend if you have reactive hypoglycemia. It was a pretty hard 3 days.
Wow.
It was a
Oh
pretty
my God.
rough 3 days, let me tell you. Um,
Wow.
but yeah, so, reactive hypoglycemia is when you have that over response and then you end up really low and you feel shaky and you feel lightheaded, you feel hangry, you feel cravings. So those are all of those signs. You might not have that big of a spike and you might be thinking like, oh, I'm doing pretty well, but then you go really low. And sometimes you don't even have to go that low. Like, it could be like something like 72 or something that you would think is in the normal range, but you can start to feel those feelings because your body knows that there's a lot of insulin and that there's not that much blood sugar. And so you can have those responses. But that's so interesting about the alcohol and how your blood sugar stays elevated the next day and your body is pushing off that digestion because it's always going to prioritize alcohol first since it is a toxin. So the body, in the presence of alcohol, it's always going to burn alcohol first and then glucose and then ketones. And I think there's something else after that. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's called this, oxidative priority. What are we going to burn first? And it definitely has to burn through that alcohol first. And a lot of times with alcohol, people won't know that it's coming from that alcohol, or they're feeling those symptoms from alcohol. Or if you are monitoring and you do see like a 72 and you think this is fine, a lot of times feel those symptoms just from a drastic change in glucose. So it doesn't necessarily have to be too low or too high, but that drastic change can cause our body to feel, okay, this is happening too quickly. I need to adjust. And we can get those symptoms of anxiety, or like you mentioned, the heart palpitations. We can just feel kind of restless, lightheaded, those sorts of things. And I think sometimes that's confusing when we test it and we're like, why, we're fine, we're totally great. But when you see that trend and how your glucose is swinging and trending throughout that period, you can start to see that it's those larger changes that are causing your subjective feelings.
I
So,
love that. Yeah, and that's such important information to see those trends, not just one number in isolation. And I had one more thing to ask you before you can tell us where we can get these sensors, because I'm sure people are like, oh my gosh, I want one of these. I wanted to talk a little bit about caffeine and coffee, because talking about reactive hypoglycemia, that reminds me of when I used to have that. I would have coffee and then I would have a low and I would feel so shaky. And I thought it was from the caffeine. And I'm like, oh, let me have less caffeine. But what do you see with coffee and caffeine specifically with the general population that you're working with?
Coffee, I would say, is probably the most variable food that we can test. It's
Hmm.
so interesting to me because some people have no response. So for me, I stay pretty similar. I might have a tiny little dip in glucose, but some people will spike from it, right? So the body kind of perceives it as like this stressor and it's going to respond with a cortisol response. Is that what you experience?
Yes,
Or
that's
yes?
yes, that's what I experience, especially with caffeinated coffee. So right now I have 25% caffeine coffee and 75% decaf. That's sort of like my happy sweet spot where I can get a little bit of caffeine, but I literally can't have more than that, or else it makes me jittery and shaky. But I still do have a response from the decaf. Even if it's just straight decaf, I still have a response. And then even if I put like if I were to do like a fatty coffee and have some, you know, a teaspoon of ghee in there, some cacao butter, even with some like collagen peptides, it's pretty, balanced. I still get I still have some sort of response. Like I can see that that was my coffee on the CGM.
Wow. Yeah. So we see a lot of people that have that experience. And I think sometimes when you are having kind of some hypoglycemic symptoms, we don't always think that it's coffee, but it could be, right? This
Yeah.
is most often seen with caffeine. And that's because it's thought to be that caffeine increases our sensitivity to hypoglycemia. And this is because it kind of reduces how much substrate is going to the brain because it's constricting those cerebral arteries. So you're not getting as much glucose into the brain, right, to kind of fuel that movement. And as you know, the brain is very, very dependent on glucose.
Hmm.
So by doing this, we're increasing brain glucose metabolism, we're boosting catecholamine production, all these different things that can, of course, cause that stressor, but also reduce how much fuel your brain is getting and cause that lower feeling, which is not pleasant at all.
Wow, that is so interesting. So takeaway message is coffee is very different for everyone. So it's really going to be dependent on, so coffee is often recommended as a beverage during fasting. And it doesn't work for me. And I've done so many fasts where I've had coffee, I've had decaf coffee, and it still is something. It's not it's not water. Let's just put it that way. So I think that if, it's just something to measure for yourself and kind of look at the response. So I had like a small shot of espresso. Oh, big spike from that, like crazy big spike from that, and very quickly too. And so having the fat in the coffee actually slowed that response. So that's good to see. So having black as opposed to something with a little bit of fat in it could be helpful. So we're just saying, of course, again, look at it on yourself and test it for yourself before you just assume that it's okay to have, let's say, during fasting, or that it does nothing. Sometimes coffee, it's like, oh, don't worry, it's just you can have coffee during fasting, don't worry, you can have it, it's no problem, there's no calories in it, there's no sugar in it if you don't put it. But it's not that, like, we need to take its halo off for some people because for some people it might be affecting them. So just something to think about.
Exactly. And if you don't measure, you don't know. You know what I mean? So if you're fasting and you need glucose to stay stable and you're, on that path, caffeine can be really beneficial for some people. It can get you past that hunger feeling. But others, like you had mentioned, it does the exact opposite. It makes you feel really, really awful. So
Yeah.
you don't measure it, you don't know. So test these things out on yourself and never take anyone's recommendation without knowing how your body responds.
Yes, exactly. And that leads us into how can we all get these sensors, because in the US at least they're prescription only but not with Nutrisense.
So actually, we do write the prescription for our users. So they still
Perfect.
require a prescription, and we do use the Freestyle Libre Pro, Freestyle Libre. So what happens is you go to our website. So we're at nutrisense.io, and you sign up. And we have a lot of different programs. Whether you just want, a quick peer into your metabolism, You can do like a 2-week plan, or if you want to make some big lifestyle changes, you can do some of our longer plans. And what happens is you'll fill out a health questionnaire. And what that does is it just ensures that you're a good fit for our program. Right now, we're not accepting anyone less than 18 years of age, anyone that's pregnant, or anyone that's on insulin currently. So as long as you have those, you have the right phone for our app and for the sensor, you'll be approved for the program, and you can get your own CGM monitor. And what that comes with is our app, so our software that has all that in-app tracking analytics. You can measure stress, sleep, food, fasting, ketones. The sensor doesn't monitor ketones, but we do sync with Keto Mojo so that you can kind of see all that in one place. And then you are assigned to a personal dietitian that helps interpret your data, monitors it with you, and kind of helps you become your own glucose expert and make those changes that are going to optimize your health. So if you are interested in more, visit our website. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. So Nutrisense.io is how to find us.
Yeah, and I will link all that information in the show notes. And I really wish I knew some of that information before I put on the Nutrisense sensor. Like, I didn't know that you get synced up with a dietitian, even though it was like there. I thought it was just kind of like an automated thing. But, that's the difference between just getting a prescription and just doing the Freestyle Libre yourself. You're getting someone to work with you and troubleshoot things and be like, what the heck just happened here? Or how do I fix this? It's a really great idea to pair this new device and all this information, this data that you're getting, and to have someone to help you there to kind of interpret it. And so it's such a great it's a great tool, and it's a great resource to have someone as knowledgeable as you helping with interpreting this data. So thank you so much for being on the show. This was
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great talk. So I appreciate you and all that you're doing. You're doing awesome work as well. And then, yeah, if you want to find out more, come see us. We're happy to work with you. I always like to mention that we don't prescribe any one diet. We're looking at you and your preferences, and there's no one size fits all diet. So we're here to help make a signal out of all the nutrition noise and data that we're getting and help you find what's right for you.
Yeah, I love that because, our needs change all the time, and, it's diets can change. And I think that it's great to be able to find this optimal health no matter what kind of style of eating that you have. And it's, there's going to be some commonalities, there's going to be some things that shift, I'm sure, but you can learn so much valuable information about yourself that's not only important for the short term, like we talked about all those short-term effects of the blood glucose, but also coming back full circle to what we talked about at first, prevention. We're preventing chronic disease by managing our blood glucose. And it's so wonderful. It's so powerful. And it's such a great investment in your health. So if you're thinking about it and you're like, oh, I don't know if I should do it, it's such great information. And you can do, like you said, those 2 weeks. And so even if that's all you can afford right now, just get those 2 weeks and, maybe set aside certain things that you want to test. So this is what I didn't really do when I had the monitor on. I just kind of I was like, well, this is how I eat. So maybe for a few days, you want to just do like, this is how I eat. Then you want to try to change something. Then, you want to experiment with something else. So make this time, make the time with the monitor, count for you, and see, tweak some things and see what happens, because that's the beauty of it, of that, peeking into this window of what's going on inside your body. So cool. Thank you for being here, Carlee.
Thank you so much.
All right, we'll talk soon. Bye.